Yeah.
And I thought it would be fun for us to start by exploring this question. This is actually a great question for anybody who's watching or listening to ask their friends as kind of a marketing research exercise or a podcast marketing research exercise. Jeremy, what was the last show you subscribed to or listened to for the first time?
Yeah, so I was looking through. I don't like listen to new shows very often. I have my like tried and true, and actually I don't listen to very many at all. I'm like I'll pick like one or two, and that's all I listen to on a regular basis. And I'm very protective of my podcast space. But the last one, I'm pretty sure. Well, you know for sure one of the co-hosts, which is Cortland Allen from Indie Hackers, and it's I don't know if you know Julian Shapiro as well.
Yes,
He's been on the Indie Hacker Show a bunch of times. And so it's the show called Brains. So this is the cover art. I don't know if anybody can see that. It's kind of hard to see.
Yes.
I think in actually one of their Indie Hackers interviews, they talk about creating this show, which is like, go listen to that because that's a fascinating conversation on developing a podcast. But this was the most recent one that I've subscribed to. It was maybe a few months ago. And I think like they've been doing this for over a year and they only have like 7 episodes. And that like part of their tagline here is, smart minds on the internet meet each other for the first time. We only release when we have something good. And like, that's pretty much it. And I was like, man, that's like such a power move there with the podcast. They're not trying to make that their full-time thing, I don't think, but that is my most recently subscribed show.
Yes. I too have listened to that show and subscribed. It's also interesting to hear what makes people listen for a long time. If I was asking, if you're in a coffee shop or you're with some friends, or sometimes when I'm on the chairlift snowboarding, this will come up and I'll say, well, what shows do you listen to? And often they'll tell me about a show they've been listening to for a long time. Very interesting. What makes people listen for a long time? For me, that show is Marc Maron, WTF. I've just been listening to that show forever. These days, I just listen to the monologue at the beginning. Why? Why do I keep listening? I just want to check in with Mark. How's Mark doing? What's Mark's life update? I feel like I've been sharing life with Mark, commuting all through many phases of my life. And it's just kind of like talking to an old friend, and someone who's struggled and made it through struggles. There's something about that continuity for me that keeps me subscribed or keeps me following the show. The most recent show I subscribed to is the show called On Attachment by Stephanie Rigg. And attachment styles are kind of popular right now. A lot of people talking about them in terms of relationships and things. I heard about the show on Noah Kagan's podcast. So he interviewed her. And I actually like Noah's podcast quite a bit. He asks all these kind of disarming questions that a lot of other people don't ask. And one of the nice things about hearing about a podcast on another podcast is if you get to know the host a little bit, it kind of makes you trust them enough to go and check out the show. And so I went and checked out the show. I think I just downloaded one episode to start. And it sat in my queue for a while. And then eventually I was like, I got to listen to this, and listened to it, and then started listening to other episodes, kind of selectively downloading the ones I was interested in. And then finally kind of subscribing and getting all of the new episodes.
And so I didn't add in mind that I had a similar. So I actually heard about Brains while listening to Indie Hackers, which I don't listen to regularly. I'm like, I don't know how many episodes they have, hundreds and hundreds at this point. But like I selectively listen through those with people that I'm interested in. Usually it's not topic based with that show, which is interesting because a lot of shows that I'm selective with, it's like I want a specific topic and I don't care who the guest is. With Indie Hackers, I like Cortland's interview style. I like trust him as an interviewer. And there's just like, it's one of the best places for people who are like building online to find out their thoughts. And so it's a great like bucket for that. And so I'll go through, and I saw Julian Shapiro, and I've always thought of him since I've been aware of him for the past few years. And he's just, I think, one of the like most brilliant minds in marketing, and especially for like SaaS marketing online. And like everything he writes is amazing. And I'd never heard him on a podcast before. I found out he was Canadian as well, but now lives in the States. Didn't know that. But I was like, oh, I've never heard him speak on anything. And he, like, everything he does is like this podcast. He like writes one blog post every like 18 months, and it's just a monster. But it's like that one thing. And I think he does some other stuff too with his team, but it's like the ones that I remember that he's talked about this before. And so I was like, oh, here's like new Julian stuff. And it's kind of hard to get that. And so when I saw that, I was like, oh, I like gotta listen to this. And there was maybe 3 episodes on Indie Hackers. And then one of those, they talked about this new podcast. And I was like, well, of course I'm subscribing.
Well, and this comes up so often because, of course, all of us as podcasters want more listeners. That's what we all want. Even if we don't admit it, we all want somebody listening to the show, and we want that number to be increasing because we're putting a lot of time into this. We're putting a lot of our creativity into this, and it just feels good to have an audience and a growing audience. What's difficult is taking yourself out of the creator's shoes and putting yourself in the audience's shoes and going, well, why would anybody listen to this show? What other options do they have? How are they going to hear about it? And then what is the on-ramp to them actually getting my show in their podcast player, in the place where they listen, trying it out? And then what's the on-ramp to them becoming a regular listener, if that's, the goal? And I think we're going to take people through a variety of things. One is just the concept of the show itself, what makes a good show in terms of the idea, how to make that compelling, what you should do before you launch a podcast, and then what can you do if you've already launched a podcast? Because I know there's a lot of people here in the chat. We've got a lot of folks talking, interacting. This is great, actually. They've got their shows, and they have existing shows they want more listeners for. But as your homework today, everybody who's watching, go and do some research on jobs to be done. You can start with Creighton Christensen's book. He's now sadly passed away, but a Harvard researcher who wrote a book called Competing Against Luck. But the idea that any listener is hiring your podcast to do a job in their life is just so fundamental. And once I understood that, it helped me craft a show on a variety of levels. So we hire podcasts on a general level to do all sorts of things. Distract me while I'm driving my car to work because the commute is boring. Entertain me while I'm taking the dog for a walk. Make doing the dishes less boring. Help me to feel connected relationally to somebody else, somewhere else in the world. Like I said with Mark Maron, I'm just always checking in on him. And I think understanding these jobs to be done on a general level and then sharpening them up to the point where it relates to your show. So there are certain shows I listen on my way down to the office as I'm walking to the office because I'm hiring them to get me thinking about business stuff. They're business podcasts. They're fellow bootstrappers. There's people operating software businesses. And listening to, for example, Brian and Jordan on the Bootstrapped Web podcast, listening to them gets me hyped up. It gives me ideas for my day. That's what I'm hiring that podcast to do. At the end of the day, I might listen to something that kind of, calms me down or distracts me or is entertaining.
I mean, so the clearest, you gave some great examples there. The clearest one to me of a job to be done is this has become a whole genre is the the sleep aid podcasts. It's so clear. The reason you listen is to put you to sleep. Like that is they're very good. I mean, the good ones that have grown are and it's kind of obvious in that case that they would put that in the description. Like it's you can kind of get into some funny copywriting stuff too. Like the podcast that the point is you don't hear the end of it, or whatever it is, where it's kind of the podcast that's not meant to be listened to, or whatever it is. I've seen some clever kind of copywriting like that, but they know that the whole point here, I need to make this so boring but minimally engaging so that people aren't, their mind isn't wandering, but it's not interesting.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, and friends beyond the binary.
And so there's
Yes.
there's such clarity there on this job to be done that and obviously the listeners are very aware as well. Like that is one of the clearest examples that comes to mind of like somebody's listening to this not to do anything except to fall asleep, and they're never going to listen during the daytime or anything like that.
Yeah. And I think people can see that this is why getting to craft a show from the beginning with these ideas in mind is so helpful. Another great example of a job to be done show is the Mindset Mile, where she challenges you to run 1 mile a day for 30 days. And what are you hiring the podcast to do? She's like, I'll be with you in your ears every single day. So I'm going to publish an episode every day. You wake up with me. We're both going to go for a run. We're going to run 1 mile and we're going to do it together. Well, that whole concept of a show, that happens from ground level. You're building this up and going, what are people hiring the show to do? What's going to compel them to actually join me on the podcast and actually listen on a regular basis? So the unfortunate answer sometimes is that you might need to launch a few shows before you find a concept that really works and resonates. And the my friend Peldy says the easiest way to market something is to build something people want. And it's unfortunate that it's really difficult to apply marketing strategies to a podcast that nobody really wants. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, then there's also the element to that where I talk to a lot of people too who, especially in the entertainment style, like if the job to be done is to entertain people, there is certainly like people want to be entertained, but you also then have to balance that with what is the competition out there. And there are a lot of fantastic shows that are produced by big networks and media companies who, what they do for a living across, podcasting is one part of what they do, but like going back to this example of Disney, like their whole business is telling compelling stories and entertaining people in all these different mediums. And so if you're looking to get into the entertainment space, then you're thinking like, okay, well, the bar's pretty high there. And so I think there's also this element of, maybe that is where you want to compete, and maybe you are a fantastic storyteller and you have all the tools available, and like this is a great place for you to be. And you can also niche down to a specific audience, which can help you. But there's also this element of like with jobs to be done of like, where's an underserved audience who like there aren't really that many options for, and I'm interested in this as well, and I could really create a show there. And I mean, it depends on your motivations too. Like, do you just want to create a thing that is fulfilling to you, and that's fine? Then maybe it doesn't matter as much. And unless you start to ask like, why aren't I growing, or how can I grow more? Then you have to start negotiating with like, okay, well, how do I align what I want to do with what the audience wants? And then if it's, for a business, then you really want to be clear on like, okay, if I'm trying to get my customers' attention, what are the jobs they need that to be done that are not being done adequately by other shows out there? Or how can I kind of do a different job there?